Welcome to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard.
Hello, puppies and kittens. We have on John, who on Facebook was going by the name of the God Conclusion. We had a bit of a chat on Facebook wherein he said that some things about what he said macroevolution that I wanted to contest. And also he said that the reason he rejects what he called macroevolution is because he imagines that the universe must be planned and that there is evidence of a planner. John, take it away. Make your case, please.
Thank you for having me on the show. And before we get started, I'd like to start on a high note and congratulate you on your degree in anthropology from Arizona State.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll go ahead and say, based on watching your internet video work, a master's degree might not be out of the question for you. You're a very talented video guy. The God Conclusion is not just a moniker that I chose to use on the internet. It's the name of a book I wrote that was in direct opposition to, as you probably can guess, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion. And I don't know how much I could talk for 30 minutes before we get into it, but at the heart of my argument is, first of all, the belief that, or it's even an axiom of my argument, is life cannot evolve until it exists.
So you accept that once life exists, then it can evolve?
Potentially.
Well,
I have reasons for and objections that we can go into in detail on why I think macroevolution is not true.
Okay, first of all, what is macroevolution?
Macroevolution is the descent with modification, the origin of a new species or creature descending from an existing species.
So you're saying that when Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and other evangelical
if you don't mind, if we could not get into Ken Ham and Ken Hovind and those guys, I'd like to just stick with my argument and your argument.
But that'd be fine. But you're saying that when they admit that speciation has happened and is observed, they're mistaken.
In my opinion, yes.
Okay. So you understand that even young Earth creationists, even the people who argue against macroevolution, admit that macroevolution happens and that speciation is observed and has been documented.
Okay.
Okay, you're saying that it's not possible.
I don't believe it happened, and I can explain in detail why I don't believe it happened.
Okay,
but
you don't believe it has happened and has been documented?
Correct.
Okay, explain to me how what has happened has not happened.
I'm not sure I follow that question.
Okay. We, in agriculture, for example, we've been using evolutionary principles throughout the entire history of agricultural and animal husbandry. We've actually seen speciation happen both in the field and in the lab. New species emerge from existing species. It's a thing that happens a lot, and we can document that throughout phylogenies, throughout not just the fossil record, but in real time and in existing animals. When we do genetic phylogenies, for example, we see not only confirmation that we have derived domestic dog breeds from Asiatic wolves, but that there are also other species of dogs that were never wolves. And we can confirm that, yeah, they're dogs, but they're different species of dogs. And the same goes for cattle and for cats and for corn and for a host of different crops. Corn, for example, we created that species out of a species of Mexican grass called teosinte. There was like 5 major mutations involved in that transition, and then many more to cultivate the many different varieties of maize and corn that came out of that. But essentially, there's only 5 genes difference between long years of corn and just Mexican grass, even though they look very different.
Okay.
So you're saying that what we know to be true didn't happen.
I'm
And you're gonna
saying
explain
that
how
if
we-
you look at these
Okay.
charts that are online that are famous, the ape to human progression chart that shows a chimpanzee or a bonobo or some other old world ape, but definitely and distinctly ape animal. And then at the other end of the spectrum is a human being. I'm saying I do not believe that happened. And I can
Okay, so
explain
you don't
why
understand that
in
we are
detail.
apes.
Sorry?
You don't understand that we are apes.
Apes have 48 chromosomes and humans have 46.
An ape, by definition, is any member of the taxonomic superfamily Hominoidea, and that includes the great apes and the lesser apes. We are in the category of great apes, along with gorillas, chimpanzees, and there's multiple species of each, and different species of orangutans, and then about 50 more species in the fossil record.
Okay.
The category, the classification, or the characters that identify what great apes are the type of ears that we have, fingerprints, flattened fingernails, opposable thumb, 2 pectoral mammae, the type of teeth that we have, specifically the molar that we have that comes to 5 points interrupted by a Y-shaped crevice, all of that. We are, by definition, apes, and this was figured out almost 300 years ago by a Christian creationist who couldn't make sense of his discovery. And so he challenged the scientific community to find a difference, a taxonomic difference between humans and apes, because he said he couldn't tell them apart. And then what they did was they created an arbitrary construct of a classification called Pongo, which was all of the apes except humans, which if you're going to say all of them except us, that's a Freudian admission that you realize we are one of them. But then in the last 30 years or so, the genome has come back to show that our genetics are nested within the other apes, the other great apes. That Pongo had to be reclassified, so now it's just a subgroup for orangutans alone.
Okay,
and Hominidae
can I get a word in
all of the great apes.
Can I get a word in edgewise here, please, for a second?
Sure, you asked a question, I gave an answer.
Okay. Do you agree that the first transitional creature from the great apes toward humans was Australopithecus?
No.
Okay, what was it?
First of all, we were talking about the transitional from the great apes. So the only way I can make sense of that, since we are great apes ourselves, is that you must be talking about going down to the stem. And if you're going down to the stem of apes would be proconsul. That's the earliest fossil we have for that. And then there's Dryopithecines. There's about 40 species of those, and those are pre-chimpanzee, pre-gorilla, and so on. If you want to get into early, like the split between the lineage that would lead to humans and chimpanzees and the other lineage that would go to gorillas, the closest thing we have there is Sahelanthropus, I think it is. But if you're talking about to distinguish human from other apes, the first of that, where there's a transition between the Australopithecines and humans, which is Kenyanthropus platyops, which is virtually indistinguishable from either one. And the best way to identify the best way to identify a transitional species is by whether creationists are arguing which side of which imaginary line they say it's 100% on the other side of. If they say that it's on both, if one guy says, oh, it's 100% ape, and another one says it's 100% human, now we're talking about a transitional species. Because creationists have had that same kind of argument for virtually every type of transition. Archeopteryx is 100% bird, it's 100% dinosaur. Acanthostega is 100% fish and 100% tetrapod. They can't agree on what it is. So when they can't decide, and they argue with each other over which side of that line it is, that's a transition.
It's funny you mentioned Archeopteryx because I noticed that you talked about it in one of your videos, and I made a list of a couple of things. I would like to keep this as civil as possible. And so when I say that you've said something in error, I'm not calling you a liar. I believe it's an honest mistake. But when you said that Archaeopteryx was like the poster child of transitional fossils, that's just simply not true. Proto-Avis was first in the fossil record by 20 million
The reason
years.
that Archaeopteryx is the poster child is because it was predicted by Charles Darwin in his book in 1859, and exactly what he described and predicted was discovered within 2 years, vindicating his theory while he was still alive. Now, Archaeopteryx was the first transitional recognized as such, but there have been many hundreds found just within vertebrates since
How
then.
can it transition if a predecessor was a pure bird?
Because there was no predecessor that was a pure bird, and Archaeopteryx
Proto-Avis was 20 million years older than.
Proto-Avis is not a pure bird.
Okay.
And we're not talking about a ladder either. We're talking about a branching tree. Now, Archaeopteryx was originally described back in the 19th century. Archaeopteryx was described as a true bird. And then it was decided that no, it's missing too many features to be a true bird. And then there was argument as to whether it's even part of the bird lineage. So it could be a sidestep. Now, as I was saying, since Archaeopteryx was discovered, there have been multiple dozens of other transitions found just within the dinosaur to bird lineage. Paravian dinosaurs, we now have dozens of transitions.
How
but
do we
Archaeopteryx remains
identify?
notable only because it was the first one ever recognized as such.
How do we identify a transitional species?
A transitional species, I have that definition in my book, but I didn't have the definition ready. A transitional species is one that looks like it has characteristics of lineage A and characteristics of lineage B and some characteristics partway between the two.
I understand
And
what it is. I said, how do we identify them?
I'm sorry, what?
How do we identify one? I was looking for comparative anatomy, DNA analysis in the fossil record is the answer.
Through taxonomy.
Okay.
If you have the genetics, so we use that. If you're dealing with fossils only, then we use morphology instead. But in either case, you use the taxonomy to identify it.
All right.
And that, in fact, was the very first evidence there ever was for evolution. Now, the interesting thing was that Carolus Linnaeus, when he put up his taxonomic tree in 1735, he realized that all of these things were inconsistent with creation. These are not created kinds because everything had a long lineage of a family tree ahead of it, of distant ancestors ahead of it in branching trees, in a sequence of different clades. Now, he put down 7 categories or classifications or ranks, which we now know that just in the human lineage, we have 7D. So it's 10 times that just for the named clades that we have. So it's quite a bit more extensive than he could have imagined. But his problem was that he knew that how you could get variation within a species, microevolution, but he didn't know that you could make new species. There was no mechanism for that. He thought that new species could only come about as an act of special creation by God. And then Darwin came along and wrote on the origin of species by means of natural selection. So now we have a mechanism that actually can produce new species, and that argument should have been over with then. Now, the argument with creationists back then were saying that no new species will ever evolve. We'll never witness the evolution of a new species. But now, with yourself as an archaic example of the past, most creationists have abandoned that because they realize that speciation has been directly observed and documented so many times that it's become impossible to deny it anymore. So now they push the goalposts back to say that macroevolution must be some higher taxonomic level, like at the genus level or at the family level. And Ken Ham said it could even be at the level of a new order, if necessary, in the case of elephants.
That's because the word species has been bastardized to have almost no meaning whatsoever.
Except that it hasn't
there's one species of human being, there's one
but
species of dog, one species of cat. But if you get to cichlids, there's 2,000 to 3,000 species. That's ridiculous. Cichlids, Cichlid. I don't
Okay,
know.
it's cichlids. You're talking about the
Cichlids.
fish.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so you don't have one species of dog, and you don't have one species of cat.
You don't.
You got many different species of dogs and many different species of cats to start with. And we're going with there is no bastardized.
I'm talking about
translation.
domestic
Unless you're
dogs.
reading in creationist materials, because they bastardize everything. But in science, we go with the biological species concept, which is for sexually reproductive animals. It's when two species or two individuals are closely related enough that they can and will continue to interbreed, that they're chemically interfertile, and they will interbreed without being in captivity, and they can produce viable offspring, or not just viable, but fertile offspring that will continue to interbreed. The same thing as the biblical concept of men, kinds, right? Can they bring forth after their kind? Now, when this variety continues and you have isolated groups, if you take one population, separate the groups into two different areas, say interrupted by a boundary like a desert or something like that, or a big river, then after not too many generations, you'll notice that distinctions appear on either side. So that if you have a lone wanderer in the middle ground between them, you'll be able to tell which group it came from, because it'll have those distinctive traits. That's
just
traits.
Adaptation and variation.
Right, exactly. That's what evolution is all about. Now, this continues.
No, evolution at macroevolution at that level is basically shape-shifting. You're talking about going
not
from
remotely.
one
There is no
organism to
significant
another.
difference between macroevolution and microevolution. It's the same exact mechanism continuing consistently.
That's just
throughout.
not true.
It is absolutely true. Yes. I'm sorry that you don't know anything about evolution, despite the fact that you said that you've been debating evolutionists for so long.
If it's
How
true,
can you have been debating evolutionists for so long and still not know what the hell you're talking about? I do know what evolution is. I can show you in academic teaching materials what evolution is. I recommended earlier, and you didn't take my advice, but I told you to go look up Evolution 101 from UC Berkeley. They give you a full definition of what evolution is. You can look it up right now while you're talking to me and see yes, I am right. You can look it up from any university you like and see that, yes, I am right. And you are wrong. There is not a university anywhere out there that will support what you're saying. You have this variety constantly building up through unique mutations in each group. When you have genetic isolation, that diversity continues to build until the point where you get the diminished results. If you were to get a crossbreed, if two interlopers from either group were to find each other somehow, it would be less and less chance that they would produce fertile offspring. And then as their diversity continues, there's less and less chance that they would produce viable offspring.
Now,
and then
you sarcastically
once they don't interbreed anymore successfully, they have become two different species. That's one of 4 observed types of speciation that have been recognized so far. That's allopatric speciation.
Okay. You sarcastically suggested that I read Evolution 101 from Berkeley, and I've been on that website many times. I've also read Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, and Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, and all these other books on evolution. And the reason that I don't believe it has nothing to do with the Bible. It has everything to do with logic and reason.
Okay, so you read the site where it says biological evolution, simply put, is descent with inherent modification. This definition encompasses everything from small-scale evolution, that's microevolution, from the changes in the frequency of genetic gene variations in a population from one generation to the next, to large-scale evolution, that's macroevolution, for example, the set of different species from a shared ancestor of many generations. So you read that definition, showing that I'm right about it, and yet you still are arguing against Berkeley. You're going to argue against the academic definition.
Listen, Galileo, everybody in the world told him he was wrong. And he was ultimately proved right. I'm not saying I'm Galileo, but I'm saying that if you take a logical approach and you say there's creation on one side and there's evolution on the other, immediately you realize it's an imbalanced equation.
You're right, because it's not creation on one side. It's literally fact versus fantasy. We have the fact of evolution that we can demonstrate and observe and measure, and then we have blind, baseless speculation about a magic invisible man.
Life cannot evolve until it exists.
That's correct. And so that's why abiogenesis is an entirely different set of completely different chemical processes in different chemical environments as well. Now, I can show you all the studies that we know so far, literally dozens of peer-reviewed studies on the development of life. But those are completely unrelated to how evolution works. Those processes by which life emerged are not the same processes by which life evolves. So we're talking about evolution, so we need to stay focused on that topic.
No, what you're
So you wanna
talking
change
about,
topics?
you're talking about evolution because you're trying to win an argument. I'm
trying
talking
to
about
correct a lie.
creation
You said that the
versus
things that we know
evolution
to be true
because
about
I'm
evolution are mere
trying.
beliefs. That was incorrect. I'm going to correct that error of yours. And while we're at it, I'm going to correct your definition because it is wrong. I've just demonstrated that. The word macroevolution was invented by an evolutionary biologist. Evolutionary biologists own it and they control what it means. What it has always meant is what I said that it meant. It is not what you say it meant. Speciation has not been bastardized. We adhere to the biological species concept in this case because we're talking about sexually reproductive animals. We're wrong about that too. You're welcome to correct both of those errors, and we can talk about whatever you like.
This is going about as well as I expected. You're trying to constantly push the conversation so that it's only focused on evolution.
I said once you correct your errors there, which are definitely errors, and you must correct them, then we can talk about whatever you like.
Let's talk about your errors for a minute.
Let's see. What error have I made?
Okay, first of all, in one of your videos, I want to say it was, I don't have the name.
And I want everyone to notice, you had the opportunity to admit the error when it was proven. And instead of doing that, you then changed it to try to project, to imagine that I made an error. And then we're going to have to argue where I have to show you again that I didn't make an error. And you still won't have admitted to the one we've already proven for you.
Okay. You said in one of your videos, it was about a troll that you were correcting. You said the universe has always existed. The Big Bang is evidence, but the Big Bang is evidence that the universe had an origin.
I didn't say that the Big Bang is evidence that the
universe had an origin. I said the
Big
Bang is evidence that the universe had an origin. You said the universe has always existed. That simply isn't true.
Okay, so I've talked to a number of cosmologists about this, most recently Sean Carroll, who says that, of course, the first law of thermodynamics, that matter and energy are eternal. A universal wave function is eternal.
Where do these laws come from?
Laws don't come from anywhere. They're properties. In order for a thing to exist, it has to have properties. And whatever we recognize as natural laws are the properties of reality that we have so far ascertained.
How can the universe have properties before it exists?
There's no point before it existed. And so it doesn't have properties.
From every book I've read on the Big Bang,
it can't exist unless it has properties. So the cosmologists, these are the ones who know about the beginning of the universe or the start of the universe or the topic that you're talking about. They say that there was no beginning of the universe. That
That's
even in models,
not true.
Even in cosmological models in which there is a singularity, the singularity is eternal. There was never a time before there was a singularity. There may have been a time before the Big Bang in some models, but there's never a time before the singularity.
Before the Big Bang, time and space and matter didn't exist. Didn't exist.
That means if time itself didn't exist, then as we track backward through time to get to the point of the Big Bang, that means that we have time stretching out as an asymptote, becoming longer and longer until 1 second equals infinity when t equals 0. The singularity still existed eternally. There was no beginning of the universe.
Prior to the singularity, there was no space, there were no galaxies, there was not even an atom.
And so
there was no universe.
According to some cosmologists, and some models therein, because they're still arguing about which these models are. And I can't speak authoritatively about that. When I talk to physicists, they say that they know very well what these things are. I don't know very well, so I'm not even in a position to argue with them. It's irrelevant to me how or if the universe had a beginning, but it doesn't matter. The cosmologists are telling me that there was no beginning anyway.
It does matter because you can't exist without this universe to support you.
So what? Whether the universe had a beginning or not, your God isn't real either way. Either way, evolution is still a verifiable thing that we can prove is really happening. And either way, even if a God exists, evolution is still real and the Bible is still bullshit. Either way, doesn't matter. Now, you said you had evidence for a designer, and I'd be happy to hear where you shift to arguments instead of evidence and then make the admission that you never had evidence to begin with. But I still want to get over where you were correcting me when I was already correct. And I want to cover those things.
Okay.
Now you say that you found an error that I made, except that the cosmologists are backing me up. So I didn't make the error, did I?
Okay, let's just keep going down the list. You said that no atheist believes that the universe was created from nothing. Lawrence Krauss, who I know, he wrote a book entitled.
If you read past the title, you realize that he's being tongue-in-cheek because he was creating a title that would grab people. He had to redefine what nothing is. It's not an absolute philosophical nothing there. Even he doesn't believe that the universe came from nothing. Now, bring up the next error that you happen to be wrong about.
Okay. You said that Darwin didn't believe in racial superiority.
That's right.
But the original title of his book was On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life.
And
what is a favored race if all races are equal?
Because he was talking about races of cabbages and races of mussels. And in the 19th century, the word race referred to something along the lines of a subspecies.
On the Origin of Species was about cabbages?
Yes. On the Origin of Species, he didn't talk about people. He was talking about cabbages and mussels and other sorts of organisms, all kinds of different things, but not people. Race meant subspecies. Now, he starts talking about people when he gets into the origin of man. And then he says that there is only one human race. He called out all of the anthropologists of his day to criticize them for their racism, because he made fun of them for two accomplished experts who classify the same individual differently when that individual's ethnicity is known, and yet they both classified him incorrectly. And he called out every leading authority of his time for how many races they all said that people had. Like Linnaeus said that there were 4 species of humans, and Louis Agassiz said there were 6 species of humans, and other people said there was up to 63 species of humans. And Darwin was the very first person who said, no, fuck all that. There's only one. There's only one species of humanity left alive in the world.
If there's 3,000 species of cichlids, or however you pronounce it.
Why?
If Kenny Baker, the guy that was R2-D2 in the Star Wars movies, and Andre the Giant were buried side by side in a million years past, and archaeologists dug them up, would they be classified as 2 different species?
Hard to say. We'd have to, I don't know what criteria they'd be looking at. First of all, I think they'd be looking at populations of each. And there are some times with dinosaurs that one thing had been classified.
But we know from DNA analysis now that both are clearly human beings.
Yes, we do. And we know that there's more diversity in dogs than there is between dogs and bears. That's just within domestic dogs. And then we have the genome that also confirms that bears and seals are both just outside of the family of dogs. Now, when you look at a bear or a seal, that wouldn't be very surprising. They do look a lot like dogs. But when you're a creationist, you can't accept that bears and dogs are related. You can't accept that seals and bears and dogs are related, because you got to make believe something else. But now we have the proof that, yeah, they are. And not only do we have the genetic proof, we also have the fossil
All
evidence.
right, that's
for it as well.
another little bone of contention. You're using words that you yourself said are not appropriate. You
What words
said
are not
proof.
appropriate?
You said proof. Proof
Uh-huh.
belongs in the realm of mathematics. In science,
Except in the context that I use it, which I've specified many times, that proof in the context that I'm using it is an overwhelming preponderance of evidence beyond reasonable doubt. And by that definition, we do have proof that dogs and seal, or the bears and dogs and seals are all related. Not just genetics, but also with
bisexual
fossils.
reproduction, descent with modification.
Yes. And then by the diversification leading to speciation that I described before. If you were to look, for example, and I bring up this example all the time because creationists don't seem to be aware of it for whatever reason. Sure, we have a Great Dane and a Chihuahua are chemically interfertile, and all these other dogs can interbreed, but you can't interbreed with an African painted dog, or with an Asian raccoon dog, or with a South American bush dog. Those are distinctly different species. They're still dogs. There's no argument about that. And then foxes are also within the same classification. So a dog is any member of the taxonomic family Canidae, and that includes foxes. And there's many different species of foxes as well, but they can't all interbreed with each other, and they certainly can't interbreed with other dogs. And then we have other sorts of dogs in the fossil record that are even more distinct, like the Borophagenes and the Hesperocyanids. And these are very distinct and much different than the dogs we have today, but they're still dogs. And they're definitely different species of dogs. So evolution not only is philosophically possible, it's absolutely certain. It happens. It's directly observed. It's measurable, verifiable, and repeatable, testable. Yes.
All right. Before we move on from the things that you said that I believe are errors,
What did I ever say that was an error?
I've already given you.
I have made errors, just not
I've
any of the
given
ones
you
that I
4 examples already. You
gave me 4 things that
down.
I was right about and you were wrong about.
Okay. You said that Hitler was a creationist who didn't believe in Darwin and rejected evolution as sin.
Yep.
Hitler believed in and practiced eugenics, which was...
Yep, and Darwin did not. Darwin objected to eugenics.
Eugenics was Erasmus Darwin and Francis Galton, who was Charles's... Erasmus Darwin and Francis Galton.
I thought you said Francis Collins, because earlier you said that Francis Collins created COVID-19.
That was in a Facebook conversation, and I didn't say
that
he created COVID-19. I said that he suppressed information about COVID-19 on social media.
Well, I'm not even going to argue that.
All right,
but Darwin did. Darwin explicitly argued against eugenics, which was a practice being used by religion long before Darwin. This was in practice in the 1st century already. I've seen documents are advocating for religious reasons eugenics.
But we weren't talking about Charles. We're talking about Hitler.
And Hitler objected to not just to Darwin specifically, but he declared himself to be a creationist. He used the same arguments that all the creationists do. In Mein Kampf, you can find it yourself, where he argues that evolution is only possible within limits, only within a kind, by which he means a species. And he says that the evolution of new kinds that belief in the evolution of new kinds is a sin against the eternal creator.
Okay. Hitler said a lot of things that were politically convenient as he was trying to convince people to commit genocide.
Yeah, but you know what he never said, ever? He never said that he accepted Darwinian evolution. Never
Hitler
once.
said in 1937, when we know today that the evolution of millions of years compressed in a few decades repeats itself in every individual, then this art we realize is not modern. It is, on the contrary, the highest degree archaic and far older probably than the Stone Age. That's not something a creationist would say.
Yeah, well, he says
the
when
official
we would know
biology curriculum endorsed by the Nazi Ministry of Education.
Except that Nazis are entirely creationist organizations, as is the KKK.
Okay.
And they declare themselves such. They state in their own document, in their own materials.
I don't even know how we can continue this conversation if you're just going to state things.
You could try to be right about something sometimes.
You're just you're just making stuff up.
Excuse me. I don't like to be accused of being a liar. I have credibility.
I told you I wasn't trying to
believers.
accuse you of lying. I said that I wanted to give you the benefit of the
You just told
doubt.
me that I was making things up. I can show documentation. I gave you the citations for where it is. I told you where Darwin said this on The Origin of Man. I told you where he argued against eugenics. That was in his first book, on The Voyage of the Beagle. When they were criticizing Darwin after Origin of Species came out. They criticized Darwin for being behind the eugenics in Australia. What was actually happening was that was already underway decades before he'd even come up with his theory. It was already happening when he got to Australia, and he talked about what a horrible abomination it was. So it wasn't his fault. He was against it, and it was happening long before his theory. These are just some of the many lies that creationists always tell. So creationists lie constantly as a matter of course because you have to defend the faith.
Okay, so
but I am not.
So
if I tell you where it says
something,
that's what it says, and that's where it is.
Okay.
What?
I said, so now you're calling me a liar.
You said I was making shit up. I did not. I can show you.
I said that I believed you were making honest mistakes.
If you make stuff up and call it true, that is lying. That's what creationists do. That's what all religions are. But that's not what I do.
When you were talking about Hitler, you were saying things that were not necessarily true.
What did I say?
You said that the Nazis were a creationist organization,
yes,
and they uniformly taught biological evolution in their curriculum.
No, I did not ever say that the Nazis uniformly taught biological evolution. In fact, I said the opposite.
I know that.
Hitler was a creationist.
Okay,
Hitler argued against evolution. Nazis typically, even now, are still creationists and always were.
Historian Richard Weikart.
The KKK broadly proclaimed themselves to be biblical creationists. They do not accept evolution, with the caveat.
Then why were they trying to create a master race?
Some of them will say that other races have evolved, but not white people. White people were specially created. Now, tell me that I'm making that up. And then when I show you the documentation in their own mouths, from their own pages, then what are you going to do? You're going to apologize, say, oh, I shouldn't have stuck my foot in my mouth again? Why don't you learn not to accuse people of lying until you can show that they actually said something wrong?
Okay. Historian Richard Weikart, who wrote several books about Hitler, including From Darwin to Hitler's Ethic, The Nazi Pursuit of Evolutionary Progress, and Hitler's Religion, The Twisted Ideas That Drove the Third Reich. He wrote an article called Was Hitler Influenced by Darwinism? And in that, he said the quote about evolution that I read to you earlier. And then he also said that the official biology curriculum endorsed by the Nazi Ministry of Education, as well as books approved for schools, uniformly taught biological evolution, including human evolution. Specifically,
it is commonly said that the Nazis burned Darwin's books and were supported by the Catholic Church, as Hitler identified as Catholic. And Catholics at that time were against evolution still. And as I said,
here's the problem I have with people like you, Aaron.
You hate being wrong all the time?
What?
The problem you have with people like me, go ahead.
The problem I have with people like you is that you say things that you're accusing me of lying. You're saying...
You accused me of lying. You accused me of making stuff up.
Okay.
And I did tell you that you were wrong about your definitions, and we're still waiting for your admission of error there, which I don't think we're going to get, because
no, I don't think we're going to get it either, because I don't think I'm wrong.
We can prove it.
No, you can't.
You can prove it. You can look it up.
You can't prove anything.
Yeah, the definition of the word. You gave the wrong definition. I said what the definition really is. Go ahead, look it up. You said you've been there before. Let's look it up. Which of us is right? What does it say?
If you think I'm going to go running off to...
You're not going to admit error. It doesn't matter how clearly it's demonstrated. You're never going to admit it. Now, you mentioned that you had evidence of a designer. Let's talk about another definition. What is evidence?
Oh, I had that. Hang on a second. Sorry.
And by the way, I pulled up a list from my book of different universities that teach evolutionary biology, and they all give definitions, and they're paraphrased, but they all mean exactly the same thing. Berkeley's online primer says macroevolution refers to evolution of groups larger than individual species. University of South Carolina Beaufort says macroevolutionists study the processes that cause the origination and extinction of species. Shall I go on? Because I've got another 7 or 8 of these to show that I'm right and that you got the definition wrong. And you can go ahead and believe that you're right, but I have proof that you're not.
Evidence is information that goes to establish a point. I'm trying to wing a definition. Let me just look it up.
You're trying to make one up. Why don't you look it up?
Available body of facts or information that include whether a belief or proposition is true or valid. I can work with that.
Now, the simplest definition is simply a fact that indicates. It's much more succinct, but means exactly the same thing as what you just read. So the first thing that it has to be is a fact. Now, a fact is going to be a point of data that is either not in dispute or is indisputable in that it is objectively verifiable. If you claim some fact in favor of your position, we first have to both be able to establish that thing is a fact. Like when I gave the definition for macroevolution and you said, no, it's something else, we can go to look them up and see which one of us is right. Okay, it's a fact that it's defined the way I said. Now, you have a fact. There's a point of data. We can both show that it's true. And then it also has to be indicative, which means that it has to be positively indicative of or exclusively concordant with only one available position or hypothesis over any other. So, do you have a fact, any point of data that we can both verify to be true that is exclusively indicative of the God hypothesis?
I have 10 different pieces of information that I have identified as evidence of a plan. When I say a plan, that the universe was planned from the Big Bang to cosmic inflation to abiogenesis to the creation of you and me. The evidence of a plan, the first one that I've got is Fibonacci spirals and Mandelbrot.
So what was the plan?
Those are repeated patterns that are found in nature.
What is the plan?
I don't know the plan.
Then how do you have evidence of a plan if you don't know that there's a plan?
I'm giving you evidence of plans because repeated patterns do not exist unless there's intelligence to process.
Incorrect assumption. Repeated patterns constantly exist in replicating systems. It's a property of emergence, which I realize goes against everything creationists believe in because you have everything turned upside down. You think everything is orchestrated by an administrator from the top down, when in fact it's emergent from the bottom up. But these are repeating patterns that occur naturally without intelligence necessary.
Okay. A fine-tuned universe.
A fine-tuned universe. This is a weak argument because we are only able to exist on a fraction of the surface of this one tiny rock that is not even 10,000 miles in diameter.
You don't understand fine-tuning, my friend. Fine-tuning means that the universe would not exist if any of 6
it wouldn't exist
factors
as it is
had
if it was different.
Even the slightest
and if it was
variation.
different, it would be different. I grant you. But that does
not imply. Are you just going to keep talking over me every time I talk?
Okay, make the whole ass argument. We all know it. It's weak. It's failed. You're the only one who doesn't know why it is. Say the whole thing and then I'll correct it.
Okay. Fine-tuned universe. The Big Bang created the universe from nothing. Sir Sir Martin Rees did the research, the 6 cosmological factors, and Roger Penrose calculated that for this universe to exist, the odds were 1 in 10 to the 300th power. That is a very small
odds. So we're going with the
it's a probability
the argument
argument
from improbability fallacy.
It's a probability. The heart of my book, The God Conclusion, is a probability argument.
Okay, so your entire book is based on the argument from improbability fallacy, where you can take any number of things that happened today, and if you figure in enough variables, you can make everything that happened today statistically impossible. But if you completely eliminate how replicative patterns do have a system of emergence to them, then everything comes down to a roll of the dice. And that's the way I realize that's the way creationists think things happen. They don't realize that some things have a guided, that there's a, I wanted to say deterministic, but I understand the philosophers will say that's the wrong word. It's not just a random thing. There's guidance. It's self-directed in a sense. It doesn't have a goal, but it has a means of correcting itself.
It's funny that you say that, because Roger Penrose, who is an atheist, he has come up with the cyclic conformal, I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head, but he's come up with a theory as an alternative to the Big Bang and cosmic inflation, because he's unhappy with the idea of the universe having an origin. But he admits that the universe seems to have a purpose, and it can't have a purpose if it's not planned.
Let's talk about that then. So the fine-tuning argument, the purpose for the fine-tuning argument is this strange imagination that the universe was finely tuned just for life, despite the fact that
it was finely tuned just to exist. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
well, it would be different if it was different. It wouldn't be exactly
no,
as
it
it
wouldn't
is.
exist. It wouldn't exist.
It would still exist, but it would exist differently.
No, it wouldn't exist.
Sorry, it would still exist differently if the parameters were a little bit different. No. That's the thing. That's the fact. Sorry.
You need to read more about the Big Bang.
Maybe you need to read some. Maybe maybe the problem isn't that I need to read more. Maybe you need to read something sensible that isn't entirely religious apologetics, because all of that is bullshit. Now, try also to think logically, since you dared to use the word logic at the beginning of this conversation to describe something and defend something that is entirely irrational, based on every logical fallacy there ever was. Now, think about this.
My life has been based in logic. I was a software developer for 2 decades.
Your argument hasn't had any logic to it at all. You said that what we have observed hasn't happened because you don't believe it. Argument from incredulity fallacy. Sorry, your arguments are not logical. They are illogical. You don't know what logic is, I'm sorry to say. Now, if we get back to the topic, if you want to pretend that the universe was created for us, then, or for any life, then why is it that we can only exist on a fraction of the skin of this one tiny rock, and we will die instantly anywhere else, everywhere else? How big is this universe? It would be different if God could have made one continuous plane where we could just continue wandering forever, but that's not what happened, right? So we got this one little bitty world, and we can only exist on part of it, and much of it will kill us under the right conditions.
So now we get to the point where God can only exist if he exists according to your parameters.
Except that's not at all what I said. You just completely misunderstood that. There's lots of ways that God could have done this, or that the universe could have existed that would imply what you're talking about. But instead, what we have is something that is a fact in evidence against God. We have the fine-tuning of the universe being an argument against God, because life can only exist as we know it right here, and thus far, we haven't seen it anywhere else. Everything will die instantly everywhere else we've been or seen. And the universe is fantastically huge for all of it to be completely lethal to life. Now, if God invented the universe for life, we'd be able to live everywhere. And we would live everywhere. There would be every planet. There wouldn't even have to be planets. It'd be just an endless plane. But even if there were multiple planets, we'd be able to hop to them like we could to other islands. That would be a universe that was planned for life. The universe we have is to kill you. everywhere. This universe doesn't care about us, and we only exist here. So evidence against God. What's your next failed argument?
Sorry, I'd scrolled down. I got lost as you were rambling on there.
It's disturbing that you're just going to discount whatever I say, even when I have the proof of it. And you never admit your own
You're not
errors.
even listening to my argument, my friend.
I've listened to your argument 1,000 times. It just hasn't been your face putting out that argument. I've been doing this for a long time. I've heard this over and over and over. I wish you guys would figure out the problem with your argument and still quit repeating the same dumb argument. That doesn't work. How many more times do I have to hear Pascal's wager or the Kalam cosmological argument? Once you know what the proof against it is, once you know where the argument fails, the next 5,000 times you hear it from the next 5,000 people is still going to be just as stupid. I'm sorry. I've been there, done that. So what you have, instead of evidence, you have arguments. You have arguments with the conclusion that a thing exists, and whether you understand it or not, you're going to assume a God. So whatever, fact A, this cup, doesn't matter. Therefore, God. That's your position.
Thank you for insulting me.
That's it. Creationists don't have evidence. They don't have logic. There's not a rational or logical argument, and there's no evidence to support the position. Nothing, nowhere, never was.
I was hoping at one point to get into a thought experiment with you about how a new species might come to exist.
Okay.
And I was going to use ape to human evolution, and I was going to start with...
Except still apes.
Okay.
It'd be like
when I corresponded with Ken Miller, I watched several of his videos when he was talking about how he had proven evolution and this, that, and the other. And it was just an incontrovertible fact. And one of the pieces of evidence that he offered was that human chromosome number 2 was allegedly formed by the fusion of 2 ape chromosomes.
Well,
9 and 13 or something.
Pretty solid evidence there.
Okay. And my question to him was, you use the word fusion, and fusion in mechanics and physics and normal applications means something that's an instantaneous process. And I know from what little bit I do know about biology that if you take a chromosome, you can't just misplace it. You have to preserve all of the information in that chromosome as it's moved in the genome or whatever, in the DNA, so that it's spliced together. And the word that he used is fusion. And like I said, that's an instantaneous process. To me, that was almost implying that ape to human
I got to tell everybody that John told me that if his dog hears my dog barking, that his dog would go, "Shut up!" So hard to be a podcaster with a great purities.
I've got one too. They're barking at each other.
Is yours a purities?
Yes.
Oh my word! All right, continue your thought experiment, please. I'll mute while you do.
Okay, so for the progression to begin from ape to human, one of the steps is that HC2, human chromosome number 2, had to be formed by a fusion event, or he called it a Robertsonian translocation. But still, it implied that it was instantaneous. And to me, the only way that it would make sense for this to happen would be for it to be instantaneous. Would you disagree with that?
Sorry, it took me a minute to find my mute button. Yeah, it would occur to me that would be instantaneous. That I don't know if that qualifies as a mutation, the fusion of chromosomes, because I'm not a geneticist.
I'm not either. We're just having a conversation.
Yeah, but I would think that it had to be one fusion that ended up being replicated in all subsequent variants.
Okay, but, so we had a breeding population of apes, and they got separated. speciation by a mountain range or whatever, and from the other breeding population, and this population 1, let's call it, starts to develop this HC2 fusion mutation in the population.
Okay.
You with me so far?
Okay.
All right. Now, when it happens at first, I would say, let's say there's 500 breeding pair in this population that's separated, population 1. And 10 of them, let's say, start to have this mutation. It's still relatively rare, and it may develop into a recessive gene, but it's not going to immediately be pervasive in the population. You agree with me?
So you're talking about fixation.
I'm trying to understand the process of how.
Sometimes I lose some of the terms that I need when I need them. But you're talking about that a mutation occurs, and the mutation can be in an individual and can be passed down to the immediate descendants. But whether it's fixated in the population is another matter. And there's another word, an alternate to the opposite of fixation. I can't remember it right now, but I think that's what you're referring to.
That's fine. I mean, we don't have to use it.
In this case, just like when we have Down syndrome is a chromosomal variance. It's one of the downsides of chromosomal variance. And we know that these people they're still part of the same species. They can still interbreed with everybody else. They're still functionally the same people. And so what would happen with this instantaneous event that you're talking about, this chromosomal fusion, is we've no idea what the immediate effects were, if any, but that individual that had that initial mutation was still fully functioning with everybody else, at least as far as being able to interbreed and produce viable offspring and all of that. And
Agreed.
Yeah. And there wouldn't be a first human, I think, is where I'm going with that. So you could go back, if you could see your mother at 20 years old and your mother's mother at 20 years old and your mother's mother at 20 years old, and just go on all the way back for thousands of generations. Eventually, if you've got them lined back to back several miles down the road, you'll start to notice that, hey, they don't look quite like mom does now, but you would never be able to say which one. You'd never be able to point out which one was the first person. Much the same way that we know that in Roman times, they spoke Latin, but in Italy now, in Rome now, they speak Italian, and there was never a first person to speak Italian. Italian replaced Latin, but it didn't do so instantaneously. That was over time. Same thing with Spanish and French. Both of those started out as Latin, and they became Spanish and French. And if you read documents that were written 1,000 years ago, you'll realize that this is not quite Spanish yet, but neither is it Roman Latin anymore. It's still a Latin language, but it's not Latin anymore. And much the same thing would be in speciation of people. So you look at how did French as a species, Spanish as a species, Italian as a species. The Spanish and French became there. I think they're, I forget the term. Oh, I hate when I forget terms when I need them. But there are different types of speciation. One where
there's sympatric, allopatric, and parapatric.
Cladogenesis is what I was going with
for
Spanish and French. Yeah, cladogenesis, and I forget what it is for Italian. It's not anagenesis. But it's where Italian replaced Latin. So Latin has to go away for Italian to exist. But Latin doesn't have to go away for Spanish or French to exist.
Okay, getting back on point here for a minute. Do you agree or disagree that at some point in the evolutionary process, that chromosome, HC2, has to go from being a recessive gene or a recessive trait to a dominant trait?
I don't know how to answer that question. I really don't.
Okay. It seems to me that's a fundamental sticking point when it comes to macroevolution.
Here's why it's not. The gene for 6 fingers, what we call pentadactyly in humans, is dominant. Practically nobody has 6 fingers, but that gene is dominant.
How can it be dominant if nobody has 6 fingers?
Strange but true, right? Yeah, I don't know how that happens either. And that's why I can't answer your question authoritatively. I don't do genetics, so I can't tell you. I've taken genetics, but I don't know how to speak on that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I noticed on your videos that you call people at the top of the donor chain epistemists. Is that?
Epistemist it's a word I wanted for a long time. And a friend of mine invented that word, and I just happened to have a symbol in need of a word to go with it. And so we put those together.
Congratulations. It's now officially on the internet.
Yeah.
I was able to look it up and come up with a definition for it.
Yeah. So my friend Kate Farr came up with the epistemist, which is somebody who rejects faith.
Okay, but see, that's the problem I have is you just admitted that there's a lot about genetics that you don't know. So there are things about your system of beliefs
which are not faith and are therefore trust instead. But trust is not faith. Trust needs a suffix and a prefix to become faith, because faith is a complete trust that is not based on evidence. My position is based on evidence. Faith, by definition, in the context of religion, is not.
Faith, according to the dictionary, is defined as complete trust or confidence in something or someone. And I don't know how that complete trust or confidence can't be called faith when you don't know by observation or experience on your own, but you have to take the word of these other
anybody. I will accept that my dentist probably knows more about dentistry than I do, but that doesn't mean that my trust is complete. I will trust when the mechanic tells me something that he's probably right, but that doesn't necessarily absolutely mean that he's right.
Then I hope that you'll accept that my reservations about accepting macroevolution.
Except that I can prove what I'm saying. If you challenge me on any specific point, I will deliver.
You cannot prove it.
I will deliver.
Okay. You can show me things online, and you can show me bones.
This is the information highway, right? What would you prefer? Do you need me to drag your ass into a lab, or do we need to go to a field expedition? What exactly does it take? We were just talking about the definition of a word. Easy enough to clarify, right? And you even denied that. And you said you had already been there. And then later, when you said that speciation never happened, and I mentioned allopatric speciation, you conveniently came up with sympatric speciation. So you know that speciation happens.
I know it's in a book that it happened, but the cichlids of Lake Victoria, Coyne said that isolation is the key event in creating a new species. And with what?
Not every type. Matter of fact, you just mentioned sympatric speciation, which is one, if I remember correctly, because there's 4 of them, I may be confusing one of these. Allopatric is the easiest to explain because that's the one where isolation is key. But I think it's sympatric, where you can actually have a new population emerge within the old population, no separation at all.
Getting back to my point, Jerry Coyne wrote in his book, Why Evolution is True, that isolation is the key ingredient or the key factor in the creation or the emergence of a new species from an existing population. Within Lake Victoria, which was isolated for years and years, there were cichlids, and up to 600 new variety of cichlids were observed in this lake. But the marine biologist said that they were all new species of cichlids.
Okay.
And my point is that a cichlid is a cichlid and a trout is a trout.
Okay,
And
so you
I
don't
want to
accept that different
understand
species of trout are different species of trout?
what?
I got to tell you, the reason that I hate religion is the constant lying. And the reason I hate religious extremism is the dedication to constant lying. And creationism's favorite lie, which is a lie that they deliberately lie about, that they know is not true, but they still say it anyway because they're deliberate liars, is the one evolution is supposed to be one kind changing into another fundamentally different kind. Evolution never taught that. Evolution doesn't allow that. That would violate two
Okay,
of the
let's
laws.
do a logical
That would
experiment.
violate two of the natural laws of evolution, the law of monophyly and the law of biodiversity. A whatever is always going to belong to every ancestral clade that its parents did, or that every parent clade that its ancestors did.
Neil Shubin wrote a
grow.
book called Your Inner Fish.
I know that. I've read that book and I interviewed him. Yes.
Yes, and his claim is that eventually, if you go far enough back in the evolutionary history, you can find that humans were fish.
Except that a fish is not a taxon. There is no consistent definition for fish. So we use the word chordate instead, which, by the way, you will note that we are still chordates. We never changed. Fish is a colloquial term, and the term that they use for this gilled thing that has fins and has scales and all of these other characteristics, that's not consistent for everything that is universally recognized as a fish. So in order to have a consistent definition that applies to all of them, you have to go to monophyly, which is the new system of taxonomy, which replaces Linnaean taxonomic ranks. Monophyletically, pladistically, we are still chordates, which if you want to use the word fish, we are still weird monkey fish. So there was never a point at any stage.
See, here's the problem. You say we are weird monkey fish,
Yep.
and then you call me a liar for saying that there's supposed to be some form of evolution that I am calling macroevolution that
incorrectly,
is
knowing that it's incorrect.
The transition from one species into another species.
Okay, that's correct. I'll grant you that one.
Hey, yay!
Yeah, and so we have one species of trout produces a different species of trout.
There's only one species of trout, and then there are
Incorrect.
subspecies of trout.
Let me just see, how quickly can we prove that wrong? Species of trout on Google. What do you want to bets, anyone? Is there only going to be one species of trout? Because I've never looked this up. I don't know. Oh, 14 types of trout species. Types of trout species. So there's genera of different trout. There's not just different species of trout. There's different genus of trout as well. Look at that. You were wrong again. Don't you ever get tired of always being wrong about everything all the time? Wouldn't you like to be right about something once in a while?
Sure.
That would bother me if I said something in public that somebody proved me wrong, and it's happened. It would bother me. I would be humiliated. I would still.
You went and looked up words on the internet. They don't prove that there are 14 different species of trout.
How much proof do you need? What proof would you accept? What would it take for you to, because you've attached your identity to believing in a fantasy that is not true, you've made your identity into believing this fictitious thing and denying all of reality. How much reality could I then feed you to get you to understand that fantasy is false? What would it take? Ken Ham said nothing. Ken Ham says no amount of proof will ever change his mind because he doesn't care what the truth is. And I don't think you do either.
When I was a software developer for many years, I went to college. I learned about Darwinism to some degree.
What is Darwinism?
Just let me speak, please.
I mean, it's got to be another loaded word, is it? We have to pretend that science is a religion just like our religion. No, science is not a religion. Evolution is not a religion. There's no such thing as Darwinism.
It is a religion, and
Darwinism
time is your
19th century
God.
term for Darwinian mechanisms, and it was in contrast with Lamarckism. But Lamarckism is dead, despite epigenetics. Lamarckism is still dead. We don't have to distinguish Darwinism from Lamarckism. It's not Darwinian evolution anymore. It's just evolution. That's it. There's no such thing as Darwinism, and it's not a fucking religion. I don't have a belief. You said earlier that everything I know about evolution is just a belief. That was a lie. I can prove that what I have is not a belief, like yours is a belief. Mine is knowledge. Yours is not knowledge. Yours is a belief. There's a huge difference. I know what I know, you don't. That's the difference. Fact, fantasy. That's where we're at.
Okay. If the Big Bang was the origin of the universe,
and it's not,
except for all the physicists and cosmologists,
and all the physicists who say it's not.
Okay. And then abiogenesis.
Shall I call up Lawrence Krauss and Sean Carroll and get them on here?
Is the origin of life. And it was a single-celled organism, probably an autotroph.
Multiple of them.
Okay. I can't say anything that's right.
No, it wasn't a single cell. It wasn't it was populations of them. And then there were lots of changes subsequent to that before they would become anything that we would recognize as life. It's an incredibly complicated process.
Okay. Francis Crick, who came up with DNA, calculated...
That was charitable.
I'm sorry. It's getting late. I'm tired. I got up at 5 this morning. It's 8:15 my time.
Where are you?
Georgia.
Okay.
So, trying to complete a thought. Abiogenesis was the origin of life, and then for 2.3 or something like that billion years, those single-celled organisms didn't change. And then they changed constantly in every direction. But they didn't evolve into anything other than single-celled organisms. They reproduced asexually. That's not a classification
either. Okay. You can have single-celled plants, and you can have multi-celled plants. The only thing that's multicellular by definition is animals. So all of those single cells are constantly evolving into other things. And some algae became multicellular, plants became multicellular, all independently, all at different times.
Okay, I'm gonna have to shrink the window for a second because I
need to get another drink. I'll be right back.
All right.
Appreciate the conversation, by the way. I'm always trying to reach out to people, and it's frustrating because what I'm dealing with is apologetics organizations that deliberately mislead their readers continuously, misrepresenting everything. And that's why everything you say has to be corrected.
Whatever.
I was being charitable. You've been lied to all your life by professional liars, and I'm trying to help you.
Dude, you just don't know me at all.
I don't have to know you to know the people who have lied to you and know what lies they told. I do know that they are lies, and I am helping you.
No, you're not helping me.
Yeah, I am.
No.
If learning the truth is better than being lied to, then better than being deceived, then I am helping you.
All right, getting back to abiogenesis for a moment.
What would you like to know?
It's not what I'd like to know. It's what I'd like to convey.
Okay.
The odds of 10 base pairs of DNA falling.
The odds. Again, we don't have properties. We don't have processes.
Can I ever finish a sentence without you interrupting?
Because it's never just a dice roll. These are processes. They're going to be predictive. They're going to head in a certain direction. So it's not a dice roll ever. So whenever you say the probability of, then your argument is already wrong. Anything that starts with that is already wrong.
All right, the universe
That
was
means your whole
planned
book.
or unplanned. If it was planned, then these laws and these rules that you're talking about, then they have application. But if it was unplanned, then there's no reason that anything is the way that it is.
I'm trying to figure out why you would make either of the assertions you just did, because neither of them make sense. If there was a God, shit wouldn't happen the way it does. Evolution wouldn't be the way it is, not unless God is a dick or completely apathetic. If God doesn't care about anything, or if God is a committee of different people who don't care about anything, then maybe. But the God of Abrahamic religion, no, everything would be completely different than it is. If God was worthy of worship, if God was an utter asshole, then maybe it could be the way it is.
When you make a statement like that, I just don't really know how to respond.
Why would a God create a world, create a universe in which life is going to be dead everywhere? We are in a shooting gallery of boiling chaos, just waiting for the next random thing to come along and wipe us all out, as has happened a number of times in Earth's history. And then give us where we have to have sleep, for example, and in our sleep we have dreams. And some people will think that dreams are God talking to them, and then go off and kill other people or cut off the ends of their penises or whatever because they think the dream told them to. All of this kind of ridiculous madness. Why would God allow all these different denominations of all these different religions to kill each other over which version of a fantasy character they prefer? If there was a God, there would be real communication of actual truth that would be able to verify, and you wouldn't need faith. The only thing that needs faith is a liar. That's the only person who wants your faith.
And see, you're in denial that you have any faith, and you do.
I'm not in denial of anything. I absolutely reject faith as the most dishonest position it is possible to have, because it means asserting baseless speculation that is not based on reason and defending that against all reason. It is the most dishonest position you can have.
You're defining,
you couldn't make it
you're
more
using
dishonest.
The second definition from the dictionary, which applies only to religion, and faith in general is just belief or confidence in something that you cannot verify of your own.
I wrote a rather lengthy article on this in which I include dozens and dozens of citations from different apologetics ministries and different theologians and so forth to attest that faith is exactly what I just said, that it is a belief that is not based on evidence. It's assumed without reason and defended against all reason. I'll be happy to give you the link to that. And that's why I reject it, because faith depends on lies and defense of lies.
My
truth does not need or want faith. And if you had truth, you would not need or want faith. You only need faith when you don't have truth and you want to believe it anyway.
I'll hand you this. You are very eloquent and you talk right over me.
That was never my intent, by the way.
I have had a very difficult time getting a word in edgewise.
I apologize sincerely.
I accept. I would like to at least complete one thought that I started out with in this process, and that was going from an estimated minimum number of base pairs needed to form the first cell is 530,000. Sir Fred Hoyle calculated what?
Fred Hoyle was a disaster. He had no
concept.
He was
one of the most brilliant scientists of the last century.
He was a fuckhead. He didn't know anything about evolution. He was the stupidest person to ever be able to qualify as an astrophysicist. It's amazing how dumb he was. He's the one that came up with the tornado in the junkyard thing. Again, going back to rolling of the dice, because he doesn't know how processes work. He doesn't know that processes are going to generate.
I'm sorry. You can insult me all you want, but when
I'm
you start
insulting Fred Hoyle now because he was an idiot. He was also a creationist. He actually argued for creation.
I'm sorry to be crude, but you couldn't carry Fred Hoyle's jockstrap.
Do all you will. I've read Fred Hoyle. He was a moron. He was so dumb.
He
that
proved the anthropic principle. Good Lord.
Again? I mean, how many more times? How many more times do I have to read The Idiocy of Fred Hoyle to satisfy you? Do you know how much I've written about what that moron said? About the idiotic, self-contradicting arguments that he made? It was probably the worst person you could have mentioned. He was such an idiot. He actually argued for continuous creation in his desperate attempt to try to keep the universe eternal.
Fred Hoyle was an atheist for most of his life. He coined the term Big Bang to mock the idea that the universe had an origin.
Except that he argued for an intelligent designer and a creation. He argued for continuous creation.
That's not true.
It is true, and I can show you the quotations for it. I don't say things that are not true. I'm not a creationist. If I say that Fred Hoyle said something, he said that thing. He argued for continuous creation.
You also said that Hitler was a creationist, and that isn't
tornado in a
true.
junkyard thing. He argued for an intelligent designer using, by the way, the exact same argument you did, because he knew fuck all about evolution. He kept thinking it was a probability thing, that you had to roll dice a bunch of times. He was a moron. He was so dumb that the idea that
I'm sorry, but a guy. I'm sorry, and I'm not trying to insult you, but I just think it's hilarious that a guy with a Bachelor of Science degree is calling a PhD a moron.
I've debated lots of PhDs who are morons. Would you like to be introduced? I've met several. Now, I have great respect for academics. I do. But I've met 2 or 3 people with doctorates that are utter idiots. I know. I can think. Here's one for you. Perineon Senapathy. He was a geneticist working for the Human Genome Project. And he believed, he was against evolution. He believed in abiogenesis, unrelated abiogenesis, billions of unrelated abiogenesis events. This guy was so dumb that he thought that blue crabs and fiddler crabs and every other species of crab did not evolve from a common ancestor that was a crab. He thought that they all spontaneously generated out of the ocean, out of abiogenesis events. Billions and billions of abiogenesis events. That man had a PhD and was working on the Human Genome Project, and he wrote something that stupid. You can have a PhD and be a complete idiot.
I just don't even know how to finish this conversation. Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology, which is a peer-reviewed magazine journal, wrote that the transformation of an ensemble of appropriately chosen biological monomers, amino acids and nucleotides, into a primitive living cell capable of further evolution appears to require overcoming an information hurdle of super astronomical proportions, an event that could not have happened within the time frame of the Earth. And that's probably why Francis Crick came up with directed panspermia, which is literally sperm from space, even though you say that space is so inhospitable that life can't exist anywhere but Earth.
Except that panspermia does not mean life came from space. And Francis Crick's quote is not what you're implying here. I once got a chance to talk to Richard Leakey, and I had to contact him because I was talking to these creationists, and they were quote mining a bunch of different scientists. They'll take one sentence out of this book or out of this paragraph or whatever, where if you take that one sentence, it sounds like they're saying the very opposite of what the whole paragraph says.
Oh, the universe from nothing, Lawrence Krauss.
Shall we bring in Lawrence Krauss to the conversation so that he can correct you on this? Because I've talked to the man about this. Okay? So, as I was saying, I hear all of these quotes from all these scientists, and then when you get to the actual where the quote is from and read the whole page around it, you realize, oh, that's not what he said at all. The only way it looks like that is if you clip this one little sentence out, which means that they knew, whoever clipped that sentence knew what the whole paragraph said, and that it actually said the opposite of that, or that he was actually talking about something different than that. It's called quote mining. So there was one where I was arguing with this young earth creationist website, and I got to show where 13 of their 14 quotes were completely dishonest misrepresentations. But there was one from Richard Leakey that I couldn't find any reference for. It was something he supposedly said on a TV show in South Africa years ago. No copies of it or anything. So I wrote to the man, and he wrote back to me saying that he was talking. First, he mentioned the astonishing stupidity of creationists, and said that misquotation is the hallmark of their work in their deliberate dishonesty. So that's what they're doing. So what you're reading there, I don't have the ability to check where the original source is right now, but later on, I can put it in, when I find it, I can put it in the comments to find out what he really said, what the whole paragraph said, and find out that it says exactly the opposite. So, as we've been at this...
what?
We've been at this an hour and a half. I'm keen to go on, but I don't want to continue to ramble. So I want to get focused. Go ahead.
Okay. Speaking of quotes.
You going to give me another quote mine?
I don't know how to have a conversation with you, to be honest.
How about give me something that's actual, factual, real stuff? Don't just quote some scientist out of context that when we see the whole paragraph, we realize that they're saying something opposite of what you're misrepresenting here. Because I've been all over that. Give me something. You said you had evidence of God. Give me a fact that we can both show to be true that is actually indicative of your position and isn't just an argument. It has actual evidence. Give me a fact that implies a God, and not what you did do, which would give me a fact that actually shows that there is no God.
When I look at my list, I see what I believe to be clear, almost incontrovertible evidence of intelligent design, an intelligent designer.
Let's just look, before we even hear about those things, let me ask you a question. Why is it that the majority of scientists, even in the United States, which is like the most Christian country in the first world, right? Even the majority.
It's irrelevant.
What?
Whatever you're about to say is irrelevant. The majority of anybody is irrelevant. It only matters for the purposes of this conversation.
You're saying that you have incontrovertible evidence for God, yet the experts in the very fields that you're referring to don't believe in a God. Why is that?
Because they're biased.
Biased?
Yes.
How can you be biased if you have evidence of a God? What bias could possibly matter?
Okay, the Wald quote I was about to read you, I will now read you anyway. There are only two possible explanations for how life arose: spontaneous generation arising to the evolution, or the supernatural creative act of God. There is no other possibility. Spontaneous generation was scientifically disproved by Pasteur and others, but that can leave us with only one other possibility, which is that life came as a supernatural act of creation by God. But I can't accept that philosophy because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in what I know is scientifically impossible: spontaneous generation leading to evolution.
That was, whoever wrote that was an idiot. I don't even know who
George Wald. He was like the father of biology.
Okay, sorry. Spontaneous generation was never the origin of life. Spontaneous generation was a supernatural belief in vitalism. Do you know what vitalism is? It was George Stahl's
I've heard your speech on this, and I want to understand the difference between matter coming from non-matter.
But that's not it. George Stahl came up with this idea of vitalism because he too was an idiot. He realized that if he puts old grain in a jar without a lid on it, that he'll
Good
find
Lord,
mice
are
in the
you
jar
the only
later.
smart person on the planet?
Sorry, we're talking about the 1600s now. Yeah, people were stupid.
You know what? In 2000 or 200 BC, they made the Antithecra device, which was an analog computer and had functions and calculations that modern people would have a very difficult time reproducing.
Okay, but you notice how I'm not even able to get to the point because you want to interrupt to complain that I'm interrupting you. Spontaneous generation was a supernatural belief in vitalism. The idea that as you die, your soul dies with you, and that the supernatural life force that animates living things rots, and as it rots, it would produce maggots, molds, and mice.
I've already
right?
heard this.
Then why are you arguing for something you know is wrong?
Because Wald said
arguing
in
for
his
something they know is
quote
wrong?
that spontaneous generation and abiogenesis are basically the same thing.
Exactly, completely different. They're not even related to each other. So there is no vitalism. We understand that life is a chemical
Okay,
process.
Wald was wrong.
There is no animating life force. There is no vaporous fluid that emanates from dead bodies, and that's the reason why they stink. And it doesn't spontaneously generate maggots, molds, and mice and other things. We know that spontaneous generation, which was disproved by methodological naturalism, which is another thing creationists hate, by a guy who supports abiogenesis, by the way. Louis Pasteur supports abiogenesis, or supported. But those are not the same thing. They're not even related to each other. So if you want to quote
whatever
some
you
guy
want to
who's
call
talking
the
out his ass about
event
things he didn't
of
know about, how is
life,
that relevant to our conversation?
Whatever you want to call the event of first life, the origin of life, since we can't agree that spontaneous generation and abiogenesis are the same thing, why don't we just call it the origin of life?
That we don't call it that only because spontaneous generation is a label we have given to a supernatural belief in an animating life force, and we know that no such thing exists.
You just love hearing yourself talk, don't you?
I'm sorry. Should I just every time you say something wrong, should I just let it go? Should I just let you say all the errors without any correction? Is that what you would prefer?
I would like to be able to make a point.
I bet you can't do it in less than 5 errors. Go ahead.
All right, let me look at my cheat sheets. Fair enough.
All right. Thank you for. I'll go ahead and let you go with that, and let you say whatever you want to end the show.
No, I don't want to make any parting comments or anything like that. It was hard enough to get a word in edgewise. I will repeat, I do appreciate the opportunity to try to communicate with you. It wasn't very easy. And best of luck. Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.